Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Friday, May 23rd. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. This year marks 50 years since the end of the Vietnam War.
It really saddened me because you're just shaking your head and saying, what a waste. After knowing so many people who died, so many people had suffered as prisoners of war.
Coming up, we speak with an author who reflects on its impact as well as his upbringing on the Naval Air Station in Lemoore. But first, these news headlines. A tax bill passed early on Thursday by the U.S. House includes major reforms to Medicaid. As KVPR's Carrie Klein reports, a Valley Republican who said he would not support Medicaid cuts voted yes.
The One Big Beautiful Bill Act would require some able-bodied adults to work in order to qualify for Medicaid. It would also reduce payments to states, hospitals, and doctors that treat Medicaid patients. Tanya Pacheco-Werner is with the Central Valley Health Policy Institute at Fresno State. She says that money is necessary for attracting doctors to rural areas.
I think that our impact is very, very dire with this bill in the San Joaquin Valley.
Especially in District 22, held by Republican Representative David Valadao. He supported the changes.
It will be very impactful to that congressional district because they have such a high use of Medicaid services.
The Congressional Budget Office estimates the bill would cut $700 billion from Medicaid. The bill is next headed to the Senate. For KVPR News, I'm Carrie Klein.
A teacher in Porterville was recognized yesterday by the school district for protecting students in his classroom. Earlier this week, a teenage girl was stabbed at Monache High School. The suspect in the case is facing an attempted murder charge and has pleaded not guilty. KVPR's Samantha Rangel spoke with Robert Sundry and tells us a little more about how he came to the rescue during this frightening incident.
Mr. Sundry was teaching his morning driver's ed class on Monday when a suspect entered his classroom and attacked the first student he saw. Sundry pushed off another student he was talking to and ran towards the suspect.
I had a chair in my hand, kind of like a line tamer.
He says the moment was a blur. He had one thing on his mind.
The threat had to be gone as quick as possible.
The encounter forced the suspect to drop his things and run away. Sundry later learned it was one of his former students. He has taught at the high school for 19 years. All of this has been emotional for him.
I've been on a roller coaster. I've been laughing, crying, and all sorts of stuff,
His daughter thinks he's a hero now. She calls him Batman. But he doesn't feel like one. He says he just did what he had to do. For KVPR News, I'm Samantha Rangel.
Merced State Senator Ana Caballero announced this week that she is running for California Treasurer in 2026. She's already framing her candidacy as a fight against the Trump administration. That's because the federal government has recently moved to cut funding from several state departments. Caballero represents parts of the San Joaquin Valley and said in her announcement that she understands the concerns of everyday Californians. She pointed to her fiscal experience from her time as mayor of Salinas. There, she said she turned the city's deficit into a surplus. If elected, Caballero would be the first Latina to hold the treasurer position. Farm bankruptcies are on the rise. The number of farmers filing for bankruptcy rose nationally last year for the first time since 2019. That's according to the Business Journal. The news outlet attributes the rising bankruptcies to inflation and falling values of crops and land. In the San Joaquin Valley, the number of people and businesses filing bankruptcies rose overall last year.
Support for Central Valley Daily comes from Body 20 in Fresno's Fig Garden Village, offering full-body electromuscle stimulation training sessions. It's a high-tech, time-efficient way to help preserve and rebuild lean muscle. Each 20-minute one-on-one session is guided by a certified coach using FDA-cleared technology. Body 20 accepts health savings account cards. More information available by searching the Fig Garden location at body20.com.
And now to our main story. Monday is Memorial Day, a federal holiday that honors the men and women who have died serving in the U.S. military. Nearly 60,000 service members died during the Vietnam War specifically. It was an incredibly controversial war that lasted nearly 2 decades and deeply divided Americans. At that time, the Lemoore Naval Air Station was established in the Central Valley. In 1961, it became central to the U.S.'s military offensive power. Author and professor Steve Emerson moved there as a kid when his father was assigned to serve at the base. He writes about this in his book titled Vietnam Legacy: Memoir of a Navy Pilot's Son. It's a coming-of-age story of a young boy during wartime. Steve recounts growing up among military families at the new base and the different attitudes at the time. With a glossary of military terms and anecdotes of life in 1960s Lemoore, the book has appeal for both local historians and military buffs. After Lemoore, Steve went on to eventually work as an analyst for the CIA, later earning his doctorate and teaching at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He has published several books on the Vietnam War before this more personal account. In this conversation, he starts by explaining why he took a different approach with this book.
Well, I'd actually written 4 earlier books on Vietnam War, and particularly the Navy side of the war. And this one, I wanted to try to reach a wider audience, people maybe who weren't that familiar with Vietnam, and particularly the younger generations that are out there nowadays, that I'm sure it's, ancient history. But the idea to give people what it was like at that time, the lack of technology. I mean, we wrote a lot of letters. I relied on letters from my father and letters of him to his parents as well in the book. And also, I alternate chapters in the book to give a flow of the war, so people who aren't familiar with the war can, follow the course of the war.
Did your dad ever talk to you about his combat experiences?
He rarely did. And it's kind of interesting that I guess he was closed about it. And I think he reflected his generation of officers too. We're professionals. This is the job we were trained to do. This is the job we're assigned to do. We may not like it at times, and certainly during Rolling Thunder, a lot of the Navy pilots criticized the Johnson administration because it was such an incremental and piecemeal approach to fighting a war. And they didn't like that. But it's like, okay, these are the orders. This is the way we'll do things. This is our assignment. So we'll do it. So they kept those things close. I don't think he wanted to worry us either. And that was sort of his way. He disclosed a few more things to my mom, but the important thing I showed throughout the book, and I wanted to highlight too, is the role of like mothers as well. That they did a lot to shield us young kids from, the worst aspects of war. And, we knew when our dad was in harm's way in that, but you had sort of a young, naive attitude that nothing was going to happen to your dad because he's the best pilot ever. Every kid will tell you that, that their dad is the best, and nothing was ever going to happen. Well, of course, things do happen, and a number of my friends lost their dads.
And your dad lived on into his 80s, right?
Correct. Yeah. He passed away at 81. Sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I encourage people to look at your book because there are nice anecdotes you talk about a jet appearing on your playground in Lemoore at one point and all the kids playing on it. And you talk about your mom, who was a nurse and who played, which was kind of rare in a way for her to be so involved and so kind of a strong character as well. So really appreciate you giving us insight into your family dynamic during this time. I also want to point out in the book, I appreciated, you mentioned the piecemeal approach the U.S. took to the war. That was controversial. You talk about the landscape, how unique and different it is in Vietnam and how difficult that was, the jungles and everything. I could talk more about the war because I have questions, but to keep us focused on the book, you state that Lemoore was at the center of the Vietnam Naval Air War. Tell us about that. How so?
As I said, Lemoore was created to be this master jet base and the center of what was attack aviation at that time. The Navy had, fighter element and the attack wing. So the guys who protected the carrier, protected the airstrikes were the fighter guys. And then the attack pilots, the guys who delivered the bomb. But Lemoore was at the center because it had the most fleet combat squadrons for the West Coast. It had 27 fleet combat squadrons that were stationed at Lemoore during the war over various times. And over the course of the war, they lost over 300 aircraft, 118 pilots killed, and 48 were captured. So it was the most losses suffered of any naval air station during the war.
You know, just weeks ago, Vietnam celebrated the 50th anniversary of the end of the war. The country's communist to this day, but not divided anymore. And when that happened, that 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, I read various reports on that day with different reactions. What did that day bring up for you?
For me, it was very tough. By this time, we had left Lemoore. Now, in 1975, I was a senior in high school in Northern Virginia. My father was stationed at the Pentagon at that time. And I, like everyone else, was watching the news. I mean, we had old-fashioned TVs in the school dispersed around. And just seeing the images of helicopters landing on decks of carriers off the coast, and then people jumping out, and of course the helicopters being pushed overboard because there was no room, and they had to make room for more planes ditching alongside ships so the pilot could be rescued. Just whole panic scene. And then as I saw more and more, I mean, it really saddened me, because you're just shaking your head and saying, what a waste. Is this how it's going to end, after knowing so many people who died, so many people had suffered as prisoners of war, knowing my dad and many others had risked their lives. So it was really tough. And I think it was harder too, because I was away from Lemoore. And had I been in Lemoore, it would have been more with the group of people who had gone through the same experience. Northern Virginia, there were only a couple military families at my school. So it was kind of tough.
For those interested in your book, what's your hope for their biggest takeaway?
I guess the biggest takeaway, I like people to just look at the times and see what it was like. I think the big thing is, yes, there's sacrifices to be made, but there's also a lot of rewards in knowing that you're serving your country, that you're able to do something, particularly in naval aviation, that few people can do. Landing an airplane on a carrier deck at night, in rough seas is a pretty unique skill.
Mm-hmm.
And then also I don't want to forget people, and my dad was a big person on this. Don't forget the people who maintain those airplanes, who are there for you, who make sure that everything's in orders, make sure your parachute is packed right, those types of stuff. And I guess that was one of his mantra, and it's repeated over and over in the book about take care of your people first. And that's a lesson I learned, and I tried to, follow through my, leadership experience as well.
That was my conversation with Steve Emerson. He recently released his book titled Vietnam Legacy: Memoir of a Navy Pilot's Son. And the Central Valley Daily team will be observing the Memorial Day holiday on Monday. We will be back with a fresh episode for you on Tuesday. Have a great weekend. Today's episode was produced by Jonathan Linden and KVPR with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. You can find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.
Planet Money helps you understand the economy. We find the people at the center of the story.
Garbage in New York, that was like a controlled substance.
We show you how money influences everything.
Tell me what you like by telling me how you spend your money.
And we dig until we get answers.
I had a bad feeling you were going to bring that up.
Planet Money finds out. All you have to do is listen. The Planet Money Podcast from NPR.